Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. The Liberal Democratic Party has ruled Japanese politics really for about as long as there's been any electoral politics after the Second World War, um, up until today, with a couple of brief exceptions. But then on the 27th of October, just a few days ago, as we sit here now on the 30th, this has changed, it seems. They lost the majority in a snap election, and this seems to have taken most people by surprise. Certainly took me by surprise, and the outcome is not exactly clear either in how it happened, what exactly happened, even, or what the implications are. But here to help explain all of this and make some sense of it is my good friend and colleague, Professor John Nilsson-Wright of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and also head of our Japan and Korea's program in the Center for Geopolitics. So, John, what did happen a few days ago in the election?
Well, I mean, probably the most important issue to highlight, Bill, is that the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been this extraordinarily effective political machine in terms of winning elections, failed to deliver in terms of a majority. The Liberal Democratic Party saw its seat count drastically reduced, together with its main coalition partner, the small Komeito party. The two parties received 215 seats out of 465. So that's less than a majority. And while there were some expectations that the government might be punished, there was an expectation going into this election with a new leader, Mr. Ishiba, former defense minister, 5 times candidate to be the LDP leader, who had succeeded, to some surprise, about a month or so ago. Shortly after becoming leader, he announced a snap election. But going into this election, despite high hopes that the new face at the top of government would generate new optimism, he signally failed to deliver. And so we've had this dramatic result. And I think there are probably 3 principal reasons to explain why the government did so badly. And one shouldn't underestimate just how bad this is. The last time the LDP was thrown out of office was back in 2009, when then the main opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, won. But this time they lost. Less, I think, because the electorate wanted to change horses, but rather because they wanted to punish the government for its perceived failures on 2 or 3 issues. The first issue, political corruption. For about the last year, there has been a fundraising scandal which has affected the LDP. The use of funds raised in informal parties to support members of the LDP broke out into the open, and under former Prime Minister Kishida, we saw a steady decline in support for the LDP, a real plummeting of decline for the LDP under Kishida's leadership. Prime Minister Kishida has spent a lot of time trying to use his activism in foreign affairs, in diplomacy, to demonstrate that by walking tall on the world stage, the LDP in Japan would garner new support at home. But unfortunately, it was this fundraising scandal that steadily chipped away at the confidence that the electorate had in the government. The second issue, which goes back a little bit longer, 2 or 3 years now, is a scandal involving fundraising again, this time from the controversial Unification Church. And you may remember that it was the scandal over the Unification Church's alignment with the LDP that led very, very unexpectedly to the assassination of late Prime Minister Abe, assassinated by the son of a woman who had donated to the Unification Church, whose funds had been used to support the party. And the party's failure to really address that issue directly in a way that convinced the electorate that the party was cleaning up its standing when it came to money politics, also, I would argue, has counted against the government. The third issue, however, is perhaps a more fundamental one, which is about the state of the economy more generally. We have seen a steady decline in the value of the yen. That has meant that for Japanese consumers, import prices have gone up dramatically. And for Japan itself, a country that depends so heavily on food and energy imports, there's no doubt that the decline in the yen has added to this perception that the LDP hasn't really had a grip on economic issues. So it's a combination, if you like, of three factors: corruption, two variants, if you like, of corruption, the public funding issue and the question of the relationship with the Unification Church, and this more systemic question of economic competency. And all of that has added up to a disappointment. I would add one other factor, however, which is when Prime Minister Kishida resigned in the face of declining popularity and opened up a contest for the new leadership of the LDP, Mr. Ishiba, by presenting himself, if you like, as a clear outsider, a bit of a political maverick, sought to be able to present himself as a new breeze for the political party. His problem was that immediately after becoming leader of the party, he junked most of the signature issues that he identified himself with as a candidate. So whether that was support for an Asian NATO, cleaning up the political fundraising issue, renegotiating critical agreements with the United States, governing the status of US forces in Japan. All of those issues made it seem, I think, to the electorate, Mr. Ishiba was perhaps not the clean breeze that he was keen to present himself as being. So that's added to the woes of the government. And even on that fundraising question, as a tactical move to deal with the question of key members of the party who had been involved in some of those alleged corruption cases, the party delisted. They took the whip away, to use a British analogy, from quite a large number of LDP candidates who then were forced to run as independents. But it was revealed in the course of the election campaign, very dramatically, that head office of the LDP had provided 20 million yen's worth of direct funding to the chapters of those so-called independent candidates, further compromising the party's reputation for political integrity. So it's kind of a perfect storm of corruption plus economic competency plus skepticism about the kind of political authenticity, if you like, of Mr. Ishiba.
But that's really quite interesting, and some of those factors one would think are maybe sort of less anomalous or less surprising. I mean, Japan has had sort of structural difficulties with the economy for more than 30 years at this point, and a lot of the economic malaise could be actually, I think, rightly attributed to kind of long-term structural issues more than short-term management, particularly for a prime minister who's been in office only for a few weeks before calling the election. But a couple of things actually struck me as rather interesting or less straightforward in the factors that you've talked about. Likewise, I think the sort of general fundraising, sort of run-of-the-mill, dirty money in politics issues is also fairly straightforward. But less straightforward is one aspect of sort of changing issues, and Ishiba changing issues essentially by de-emphasizing the foreign policy, international affairs, national security issues that he emphasized when he was a candidate for the leadership, and instead turning to more domestic politics, economic management, corruption issues, and party discipline issues, actually. But it's interesting that it seems that the foreign policy issues and the national security issues would have been political winners for him, given that was sort of Kishida's game that he failed at, or failed to sort of gain political traction, if you see what I'm getting at. How is it that this shift away from international affairs was so hurtful or so risky for Ishiba, when in fact overemphasis of international affairs is part of what undid Kishida?
I think it's probably suggestive, and I can only go as far as saying it's suggestive because I don't have direct empirical evidence, but the suggestion is that the party barons, if you like, surprised by Ishiba's victory. I mean, all the money was, I think, going into the leadership election that Takaichi Sanai, a more hawkish nationalistic politician, a woman who was seen as the natural inheritor of the Abe mantle, was going to win the election. And her sort of more nationalistic stance, I think, was alarming to international actors who looked at the United States and some more moderate voices within the LDP. who felt that I think Takaichi's approach on controversial national identity politics issues might complicate relations with Japan's neighbors. But I think it was this short-term strategy of pushing for an election which needed to be fought on domestic issues. Typically, elections, are won on the domestic economic agenda issues. And so I think maybe tactically, Ishiba felt the need to do that, and also to demonstrate to members of his own party that he was still inclined to practice conventional politics, so not to alarm other members of the LDP, with the idea that maybe he would park some of these bigger foreign policy issues to post-election management.
Right. Now that does make sense as sort of a tactical maneuver, but it seems that it may actually have undermined his position, particularly when some of these aspects of the way that party discipline was imposed came to light, right? That it was less real party discipline than it appeared, right?
Also, on this question, I think of, if you like, hypocrisy, right? Shifting his position. Running as a candidate, Ishiba had been reluctant to embrace this idea of a snap election.
Yeah.
He had been at least ambivalent on that question. And then the man who he put in charge of the campaign, who was one of his political competitors going into that LDP presidential contest, Koizumi Shinjiro, Koizumi recommended a quick election. And he has now subsequently resigned in the face of the judgment of the electorate. So there was a tactical mistake, I think. I mean, a perception, therefore, by the electorate that the government was moving opportunistically to use that novelty to buy up electoral support. It's not perhaps, I mean, in retrospect, it's very easy to be critical of Koizumi, but one shouldn't forget that back in 2001, when Koizumi Junichiro, Koizumi Shinjiro's father, won a dramatic election victory on the back of similarly declining popularity for the LDP. Koizumi Senior's predecessor was a guy, Prime Minister Mori, who was very, very unpopular. And Koizumi was selected as a candidate in that contest by local prefectural chapters and party members, not the mainstream members of the LDP parliamentary cohort, precisely because he seemed like a new face. And the same sort of logic applied, I think, in explaining Ishiba's victory in the presidential contest. So it's no surprise that that Koizumi Jr. would have made a similar recommendation to that pursued by his father. But of course, we see a very different decision, different judgment on the part of the electorate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other aspect of this that strikes me as a bit sort of out of the ordinary is the scandal, or at least perception of a scandal, wrapped up with the Unification Church. I mean, that actually took me by some surprise a couple of years ago when Abe Shinzo was assassinated, and all of this news came to light about the sort of deep relationships, allegedly at least, between the Unification Church and the LDP. What's been happening with that? How has that actually embroiled Ishiba's party as opposed to Abe's?
It's been less obvious as an issue in the brief time that Ishiba has been leader. It's not been dominating the headlines, but I think it's sort of added to the background a sense of distrust about private relationships. Some of those senior LDP members who were forced to resign were also implicated. And we've seen some politicians who were caught up in some of these scandals losing their seats in this latest election. Also, the role of prosecutors in going after quite aggressively some of those individuals who were caught up in the Unification Church fundraising scandal has also dented, I think, the reputational clout of the LDP. So it's less of an immediate factor. I think the broader issue is this legacy of the fundraising controversy, the one that I referred to first, and also this perception of, if you like, taking the electorate for granted. And many of the people who ended up voting for some of the opposition parties were themselves self-identified as LDP supporters. So I think it was a way of, if you like, giving the government a bloody nose. But of course, it's left them now in this very difficult situation of how do they govern? How do they reach a majority? We will see on November the 11th, the Diet will meet, the lower house of the Diet, the House of Representatives will convene for the purpose of selecting a prime minister. And it's not immediately clear that either the LDP and its coalition partner Komeito can muster enough votes. They need to basically reach out to one of the main opposition parties. The party that did very well, the Constitutional Democratic Party, which got 148 seats, a big, more than 50-seat gain for the Constitutional Democratic Party, is the least likely party to entertain any notion of coalition with the government. So all the money at the moment is being focused on two parties. The Democratic Party for the People, which is a slightly more right of center group than the Constitutional Democratic Party. Both of these, it's rather confusing, both of these democratic parties are the sort of fragmented result of the split in the Democratic Party of Japan that governed from 2009 to 2012. The Constitutional Democrats are a little bit more progressive on key issues like constitutional revision, nuclear power, social welfare spending. The Democratic Party for the People, slightly more right of center. They have quadrupled their seats. They went from 7 to 28. So 28 might not seem a lot, but when you look at the balance in the lower house, those 28 seats added to the 215 that the LDP and Komeito have could be decisive. But unfortunately for the government, for Mr. Ishiba, the Democratic Party for the People have made it clear that they won't join a coalition, which leads attention to another party, Isshin no Kai, the Japan Innovation Party, more conservative, more right of center. They have 38 seats. And so in theory, they could be a decisive force that would give the government a majority. But they too have indicated that they're not inclined to support the government. This is in part, I think, because the opposition parties were quite clear-cut in attacking the government for its alleged corruption. And therefore, they can't, with a clear conscience, simply line up with the LDP to prop up a government directly by joining in government. An added factor, which is a further complication for those remnants of the Democratic Party, the Constitutional Democrats, Democratic Party for the People, is that both those two parties are dependent on a union organization known as Rengo. And the Rengo leadership has also made it very clear that they would look very skeptically at any decision by the Constitutional Democrats or the Democratic Party for the People to align with the government. So what I think is probably more likely, although it's not entirely clear-cut, I mean, we might see, for example, the Constitutional Democrats under their new leader, Mr. Noda, who himself served as Prime Minister at the tail end of the last Democratic Party government. They might see Mr. Noda try and build a grand coalition. His numbers are less attractive than those of the LDP, and it would be harder for him to construct a working coalition, partly because the opposition parties are so diverse ideologically. Right? We have parties like Ishin, which are quite conservative on national identity issues, on constitutional reform. When I say conservative, I mean right of center, if you like. And then you've got progressive parties like the Japan Communist Party, Reiwa, which is a small party that did well in this election. And then two smaller fragmentary, very right of center parties, Sanseto and the Conservative Party, both with 3 seats each. Putting together a grand coalition amongst the opposition parties to generate a full majority would be very, very difficult. It's not impossible. It's been done before. It was done in the 1990s when the LDP lost power dramatically. First time that they'd lost control of the lower house back in 1993. They were replaced by a grand coalition led by a new politician, Hosokawa Morihiro, the head of the appropriately entitled Japan New Party. This grand coalition lasted all of 8 months and then fragmented because the policy-based ideological differences between the component members were so acute that they weren't able to govern effectively. And I think similar problems would exist for Mr. Noda in building that grand coalition. So what does that leave us with? The most likely, I think the most probable outcome is that we will see a minority government led by Prime Minister Ishiba. There was some speculation a few days ago that he might be forced to resign and might even be replaced by Ms. Takaichi, but I don't think that's likely. I think Mr. Ishiba will stay put and try and govern with the Komeito and then rely on the Democratic Party for the People to provide support on key legislative issues, most importantly on budgetary issues. The principal domestic policy issue looking ahead, post November the 11th, if it's possible to form a new government, will be passing an important supplementary budget. Mr. Ishiba has pledged to commit to 13 billion yen's worth of additional spending. And this is going to be very difficult, I think, for the government under the current climate because of the need to reach a consensus over how best to allocate that spending with the opposition parties.
So before I ask you the next question, let me just remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions, please at any time click on the Q&A tab, which on most screens is probably going to be at the top of your window or near the top of the window, maybe at the bottom though, or at the side, depending on how your computer's configured. If you click on that and then type your question in there, in a few minutes, I will then pose that for you to John. So the question I have actually is a little bit sort of random on this. If we think about parties forming coalitions with the LDP under the current conditions, years and years ago, decades ago, when I was a student, I remember reading about sort of the very basics of Japanese party politics and the sort of the 55 system and how this worked throughout all that time. And one of the parties that I always thought was kind of interesting that sort of came together towards the latter period of that epoch is in fact the Komeito, at least the new Komeito as it was then called, right? And it always struck me that Komeito seemed like a party that was, at least on the face of it, all about clean government and anti-corruption, with a little bit of a Buddhist inflection as well. Right. And so if the Komeito of today is anything like the Komeito of 30 years ago, how can they sort of sit with themselves if they're in close partnership with an LDP that's mired in corruption and tied to these bizarre sort of Christian millenarian quasi cults like the Unification Church?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, Bill. I mean, Komeito has always seen itself in some ways as a pivotal party that can, realign its support depending on whichever way the political winds are blowing. Its importance to the LDP has always been because of its affiliation with Soka Gakkai, this Nichiren Buddhism religious organization, and also because its principal message has always been about championing the interests of minorities in Japan, either the economically disadvantaged or the discriminated groups in Japan. And that has given it great electoral credibility. It's been very good at mobilizing its voters who are politically very conscious to go out and campaign and vote. I think what's happened here is that we've seen a growth of new rival political parties, some of which are geographically concentrated. So, for example, Ishin, this more conservative organization, has been concentrated in the Osaka region, where Komeito in the past used to be able to count on quite secure support. Komeito lost 4 seats in the Osaka region to Ishin. That was a major setback. They also saw their leader failed to get elected, and their deputy leader failed to get elected. So there's been a movement against them, I think, maybe precisely for the reasons that you just mentioned, Bill, because they're seen as having compromised on their key principles. It's a dilemma for them, really, at this stage. Do they resign themselves to being tagged with this label of having compromised with a compromised party? Or do they try and hew to a more independent position? They have only just changed their leader, who was then subsequently defeated in this contest. So I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching within Komeito to try and figure out how best to move forward. For now, however, there's no sign that they're going to back away from their traditional support for the LDP.
Yeah, that would make sense. Although, one can imagine all kinds of difficult situations if there were attempts to cobble together various kinds of coalitions, right? And as you were talking about the possible sort of grand coalition of the opposition, this sense of hard right-wing parties having to sit in coalition with the Communist Party would be an odd sort of fit for them as well, even odder than Komeito and the LDP.
Yeah, and there's an interesting sort of sidebar to all of this in terms of the minutiae of this election. The communists went into this election pretty confident. They only had 10 seats, and they saw their seat total drop. This is in spite of the fact that Akahata, Red Flag, which is the newspaper that is most closely identified with the Communist Party, was the media organization that broke the news of this huge amount of financial support that the LDP was giving covertly to these so-called independents. So you would have thought that would have redounded in favor of the JCP. I think perhaps one of the reasons why it's not working is that this was really a vote against the government rather than a vote for the opposition parties. One thing that the opposition didn't do ahead of this election, which might have led to a very different outcome, would have been to work together to ensure that they would only select single common candidates in those key electoral districts where there is only one candidate standing, a first past the post contest. By splitting the vote, the opposition parties, in a sense, undermined their collective position. So this could have been a much more damaging outcome for the government if the opposition had actually decided to work more closely together. The fact that they didn't is emblematic of that core problem. Too many ideological divisions, too many opportunities in the Japanese electoral system for opposition parties to count on their long-term survival, even if they don't form a government. One of the curiosities of the Japanese electoral system is that it's divided into two parts. A first-past-the-post contest, much like the British electoral system, where a single candidate is elected, and then a PR contest where voters vote for a party. And that has always acted, if you like, as an insurance policy for the opposition parties. They can count on survival in Parliament. They can retain seats even with a relatively low level of popularity. So small parties survive without any real prospect of forming a government. The only way you can work against that institutional incentive for fragmentation of political parties is if the leaders cooperate strategically, and they certainly weren't willing to do that in this election.
Right. I mean, this electoral system, as you've described it, though, is, if I'm not mistaken, relatively new. I mean, this is after 1995, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Or thereabouts.
Yeah, 94.
Prior to that, there were these multi-member districts with single non-transferable vote. Right,
That's
and
right.
that led to much more reliable LDP dominance, I think, if they could strategize over how many candidates and which ones to run in which districts, right?
Mm-hmm. You're right. I mean, the problem with the reform, I mean, it was well intentioned, and it was that coalition government led by Hosokawa that was the initiator of this idea. The problem with the reform was that, if you like, the reformers wanted to have their cake and eat it too. As a grand coalition, it was composed of parties that recognized the danger. If they'd gone exclusively for a first past the post system, in the interest of giving the electorate a clear, unambiguous choice, right, to force smaller parties to merge with larger, more popular, more powerful parties to create a clear choice for the electorate, then they would have abandoned the PR contest, but they didn't. They kept it, and that has added to the confusion and created this built-in institutional bias in favor of smaller opposition parties. It's no accident, therefore, that despite the high hopes that we saw way back in 1993, when there was talk of a breaking of the political mold, of ushering a new post-LDP era, the electorate very quickly became disillusioned with opposition parties that seemed incapable of governing. And that has led to a pretty consistent secular decline in public engagement by the electorate. One of the other elements in this election that I think is quite interesting is the turnout rate, around about 53%, one of the lowest post-war turnouts for a lower house election. That again is further confirmation that people are turned off politics and were trying to send a signal to the government rather than to vote affirmatively in favor of the opposition parties.
Last question then from me, because we've got some audience questions that are beginning to come through. But the last question I would have is, if we do end up with a minority government, as you've suggested is probably the most likely scenario come the 11th of November, how stable is that government likely to be? I mean, it seems like it could easily, face a no confidence vote at any turn, or, would degenerate into even infighting within the LDP. Could they actually have much hope of staving off yet another election for more than a matter of months or at most a year or two?
I suppose it really depends on what the government is prepared to offer its potential ad hoc partners. The Democratic Party for the People has made it very clear that what they want to see is delivery on some of their campaign promises, primarily tax cuts and a changing of tax thresholds that are effectively a tax cut, and more generous social welfare spending. I suspect that Ishiba will probably be inclined to go some way towards meeting that demand. That will have huge problems. This budget, I think I described it as 13 billion, I meant 13 trillion yen, is going to then be even more problematic in terms of the fiscal position of the government, because already the government is overstretched in terms of its expenditure commitments, not least on the critical issue of defense spending. What will this do in terms of international confidence in the Japanese economy? Will that then provide an opportunity for opposition parties to punish the government? And we shouldn't forget that next year is another election year in Japan. There will be an election for the upper house of the Japanese parliament, which is currently held by the Liberal Democratic Party. And it may be that there are tactical considerations for some of these opposition parties to see whether they can impose maximum damage on the government ahead of that election. So I'm not sure what issues are likely to be the issues where you might see a coordinated effort by the opposition to try and force a confidence vote against the government, which they would win. I think what it demonstrates is that these pivotal opposition parties, like the Democratic Party for the People, are perhaps likely to extract a high price from Prime Minister Ishiba in order to maximize their influence.
Okay, let's get to some of the audience questions then. First up, we have a question that asks, do you have any thoughts on what all of this would mean for Japan's relationship with China? Would there be a change, particularly on military policy or security policy, or is there enough of a political consensus in Japan for this not to change too much?
I suppose I'm tempted actually to pass this back to you, Bill, as a question as a sinologist, but to what extent might Beijing be tempted to take advantage of the political insecurity within Japan as a result of this rather inconclusive electoral outcome to push the envelope in terms of security provocations? We've seen back in August intrusion by a Chinese aircraft into Japanese airspace. We've seen much more coordination between Russian and Chinese naval forces in the waters close to Japan. We've seen a much more belligerent approach by Chinese naval forces in challenging the territorial integrity of Japan near the Diaoyu Islands, the Senkaku Islands. It might be the case that China feels there's an opportunity to put Japan on the defensive. It may be that some of the opposition parties, the Constitutional Democratic Party might, for example, favor a more accommodating position with China. And in all of this, of course, we've got the looming challenge of North Korea. That too might, Kim Jong-un might also be minded to use the new confidence he has as a result of his deal with Moscow in return for sending military forces to Ukraine. Technical assistance, financial assistance from Moscow might encourage him to launch a satellite, to perhaps test more ballistic missiles that would threaten the integrity of Japan, simply out of a desire to make mischief and to sow more discord within Japan. And of course, if that weren't enough to add to the headaches for Mr. Ishiba, we've got the election in Washington, in the United States, a week ahead, and all the concerns about what a potential Trump presidency might mean for Japan. The telegraphing from the Republican side seems to indicate that a President Trump would be very keen to really try and negotiate, if that's the right word, or impose a tough bargain on Japan on host nation support and defense expenditure at a time when the Japanese government can already not afford to meet its defense expenditure requirements. Under former Prime Minister Kishida in 2022, there was a commitment to double defense spending. It was clear, for example, in the LDP presidential contest that none of the candidates had a really effective strategy for meeting that huge extra defense expenditure bill. It's likely to get worse if Trump wins. And so a Japanese government headed by an unstable government in which some of these key opposition parties might be minded to adopt a foreign policy position that is more sympathetic to China would be a source of tension. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic shift. And Ishiba has tried to, I think, placate the concerns of people who've looked at this domestic upheaval that foreign policy might change by stressing the importance of the relationship with the United States. But there's no doubt that this is the last thing that Washington needs at this stage, certainly from the point of view of the Biden administration, which has invested so heavily in strengthening alliance ties with Japan. And it's a sharp contrast, of course, to the leadership of both Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Abe, both of whom spent so much time in trying to strengthen alliance ties with the United States. I mean, we've had back in April, when Prime Minister Kishida visited Washington for a state visit, there were a number of very significant security agreements looking at strengthening joint operations, joint coordination between the defense communities of both Japan and the United States, all of which, of course, would be designed to strengthen deterrence against China, to strengthen defense preparedness against the DPRK. If that becomes more questionable because of domestic developments in Japan and because of pressure from outside, it's difficult to see how the government will provide reassurance on that issue. Ishiba has said very clearly that he plans to attend the G20 summit in Brazil, assuming, of course, he is elected prime minister by the Diet, which is still at least as a question mark.
Yeah. I mean, I think from China's point of view, they'll wait to see what happens. I don't think China is in any way in control of what North Korea does. And I think China would prefer that North Korea not rock the boat so much as they seem inclined to do. China's quite worried about sort of great power relationships at the moment, particularly with the war in Ukraine and Russia's basically weakening position on the world stage. And I think any opportunity to soften the relationship between the US and Japan would be to China's advantage, or to soften the stance that Japan has increasingly been taking regionally would also play to China's advantage. But it isn't clear how best to maneuver that in the current context of Japanese politics, but also given the situation in the US. So Biden has been very alliance focused, but has been less focused on the Pacific as an area of American foreign policy and particularly security policy, and much more focused on Europe and secondarily the Middle East. And I think Trump has certainly telegraphed, and many of the people in his orbit have said quite explicitly that they would seek rather rapidly to shift that focus, regional focus, away from Europe and even to some extent away from the Middle East and to Asia and the Pacific, in a way that could mean much more robust military links or security links with Japan, with South Korea and others, but at the same time that they'd be shifting that regional focus, shown himself to be a master of alliance politics in the past. Quite the opposite. He's sort of allergic to working well with others in any context, including important allies. So what really remains the question mark to me, though, is Harris. If she wins, it isn't clear what kind of foreign policy she's really likely to have. And if she keeps the general gist of Biden's foreign policy framework, it isn't obvious to me that she would be as much of an alliance player or an alliance-focused president as Biden has been. Biden's been really quite extraordinary in that respect, in comparison to most, certainly recent American presidents of both parties. The degree to which he's really prioritized alliances and working with allies in bilateral and multilateral ways. And so Harris may even keep the sort of general orientation of foreign policy, but not the alliance part. Or she might not even keep that. She might look to different kinds of foreign policy models. There's been remarkably little debate publicly in the United States about foreign policy in this electoral cycle. And Harris in particular has not yet been pinned down on what her foreign policy really would be. So I think there's a lot of moving parts, basically, and China probably will keep waiting somewhat anxiously to see how it all shakes out in these different countries.
And, it just strikes me, all that investment by the Biden team in building alliances with Asian partners, particularly Japan and South Korea.
Yeah.
Blinken and Austin's first visits were to both Seoul and Tokyo. I think a real clear commitment was well received in Japan. And if Ishiba had won this election and had secured a majority, you could have pretty much counted on him, I think, to focus on the issues that he really identifies himself with. He describes himself as a defense nerd from his long experience in Boaishore, the defense ministry, and even allowing for some of his more provocative statements, or at least some of this kind of convention-challenging arguments, such as establishing an Asian NATO and renegotiating the status of forces agreement with the United States. This was more about emphasis, I think, rather than any shift away from the idea of Japan having a strong defense posture and a close cooperative relationship with the United States. Now, however, Mr. Ishiba has to kind of reframe himself as a domestic political deal maker. He has to bring people together, and he has no status, if you like, no standing as someone who has a demonstrable track record in being able to do that. The fact that he was a party outsider, not beloved by any of the political factions, meant that he could only govern if he, had the implicit, at least, support of bigger beasts within the party, which is, again, to go back to your earlier question about why he jettisoned so much going into the domestic campaign, I think might be one reason why he did that. I don't know whether he has, the bandwidth or the political awareness and experience to be able to manage not just his own party, but also this de facto working coalition agreement with whichever of the smaller opposition parties align with him.
There's a couple of audience questions that I'm going to sort of package into one now, because one is very specific, the other quite general. The specific one is about how one particular party might engage in coalition politics. And the party identified by the questioner is the DPP, which I assume is the Democratic Party of the People.
Yeah.
And so basically, what might this party be most interested in exchange for its supporting a minority government? What would be the pound of flesh that they're looking to extract from Ishiba and co?
I think it's what I alluded to earlier. It's these tax cut and social welfare spending, maybe in education. It's one area they've been identified with. Their leader, I think, Mr. Tamaki, I think, is somebody who has some standing with the electorate, but I think it will be delivering on these these kind of welfare-oriented policies, and a clear sign, perhaps, that Mr. Ishiba is prepared to deliver on his message of cleaning up politics. He's talked, for example, about setting up a independent body that would survey the rules or re-examine and introduce new principles governing party funding and the ability of parties to solicit support through these fundraising parties that were so problematic in the last cycle. Whether Ishiba is minded to do that and how he will demonstrate that, I'm not sure. But I'm sure the DPP will want clear evidence that it is willing to make some real progress on this issue. But it's that need to address voter concerns that at a time when the Bank of Japan has been looking to increase interest rates to deal with the problem of loose monetary policy, to try and combat the low rate for the yen, to combat inflation. All of that, I think, remains a major problem for the government.
And the really general question that I was going to bundle with that is, how does all this affect Japan's foreign policy? So I guess in sort of the broad brushstrokes, we've been talking about some of the specifics vis-a-vis China, the United States, South Korea, Russia, North Korea as well. But sort of in general terms, what would be the impact of the outcome of these elections on foreign policy, at least in the short term, if any?
I don't think it's going to be dramatic. It's more about whether sufficient support exists for addressing some of these key foreign policy issues. I don't think it's going to be part of the horse trading with any of the potential partners. I think both Ishin and the DPP or the DPFP would be more likely to support the same sort of line that Kishida and Abe before embraced. It's partly consistent with their more kind of robust, I wouldn't say nationalistic policy, but there's certain support for a strong Japan. And don't forget, public opinion now is more consistent on the question of dealing with perceived threats, whether from China or from the DPRK. There is more of a sense of anxiety that the country needs to be prepared to deal with those security eventualities. The real issue, the real dividing line, I think, is on this question of the budget and how much loose monetary policy can be accepted, how much extra spending is sustainable. How do you address the concerns of voters that their standard of living has been systematically undermined as a result of these changes in the exchange rate? And then from the point of view of the Bank of Japan, how do you combat deflation, and how do you address those issues? So I think the focus will be on providing economic policies that satisfy the opposition parties. I don't think it's going to be addressed I don't think the discussions are going to be focused on foreign policy per se. If Donald Trump wins the election, then I think it will add to the uncertainty that the government faces. A lot will depend on who gets appointed as well in a new cabinet to some of those key portfolios, such as defense and foreign affairs.
Yeah. One more audience question that's come up is there seems to be a sort of anti-incumbency wave across many parts of the world, right? And the questioner points to the showing of Labour in the UK over the summer, the relatively crushing defeat of Macron and allies in the French parliamentary legislative elections, the bad polling for Trudeau and the Liberals in Canada, the unpopularity of Biden in the United States. And so the question is, to what extent can we attribute what's happened in the last week or so in Japanese politics to a global or structural trend, sort of a cyclical or secular movement around the world, and to what extent is this purely Japanese or idiosyncratic to aspects of Japan's society, politics, or economy?
I mean, if you think about the anti-incumbency trend that we've seen in many countries, it's often characterized as part of this populist wave, but populism itself is such a kind of broad portmanteau term. and it embodies, I think, two kind of key issues. One is economic populism, and I think you can see strong elements of that in the positioning of the opposition parties in Japan. The other is popular nationalism, really, or populistic nationalism, with all the emphasis on identity politics, on the politics of nostalgia, on reinventing the nation. And we haven't seen much of that in the Japanese context. So a party like Ishin, for example, might have been expected to be a real beneficiary, but it hasn't. It's seen its support not really increase. It's not therefore been able to capitalize on that message. I think what we saw in this election was sort of a moderate conservative reaction against old established parties that was seen as ineffectual and out of touch. But it hasn't been a kind of wave movement in favor of a new style of politics. While there are populist politicians who are prominent locally, for example, Koike Yuriko, the governor of Tokyo, who was recently re-elected, it hasn't really translated onto the national level. I think in all of this, we come back to foreign policy and foreign affairs. In the event of a crisis that really threatened the territorial integrity and the national interests of Japan, whether it was over some of these contested territories or the perception that North Korea is able to really expose the vulnerabilities of Japan, then you might see quite quickly, I think, a shift in public sentiment, and by extension, politicians who might be inclined to try and exploit that for their own benefit, which is why this question of low turnout, I think, is really important. If people are losing confidence in the electoral system or in politics in general, and if someone can step into and exploit that space as a charismatic leader, in a shifting political environment where no political party has a decisive advantage, it's possible to imagine a scenario in which there is a change of direction, but we're still some way away from that.
Hey, that's all for the audience questions that have come through. Let me just then give you a chance to elaborate or expand further on anything that we feel that we haven't fully touched on. If there's anything else that sort of strikes you as important that we didn't get a chance to come around to fully.
Well, I mean, here we are sitting in the UK, both of us in Cambridge, and it's an interesting question, isn't it? What does this mean for Britain's relationship with East Asia, and particularly with countries like Japan? We've seen so much significant progress in the bilateral relationship between the UK and Japan over the last few years, and particularly as a result of the efforts by both Mr. Abe and Mr. Kishida to strengthen bilateral ties. Last year's Hiroshima summit was a very ambitious commitment to a strengthened relationship, both in terms of specific areas for cooperation, the passage of the Reciprocal Access Agreement, strengthening cooperation between our two militaries, the new GCAP fighter agreement between Britain, Japan, and Italy, the commitment by British forces to send a carrier strike force to the Indo-Pacific in 2025. There was a lot of optimism. I was in Japan in September, and a lot of optimism about how far that could go. And at the same time, a lot of optimism about new minilateral security partnerships with countries like South Korea, with Australia. Japan's 2+2 agreement with Australia has been really developing quite substantially. And with South Korea, President Yoon and former Prime Minister Kishida invested an enormous amount of political capital to try and strengthen that relationship. If Japan is turning inwards, and that's an if, I wouldn't say it's a definite change, or at least appears to be turning inwards and has less bandwidth to address some of these new strategic opportunities, it raises important questions about how far Japan can work with other like-minded partners, European, as well as those in the Indo-Pacific region, to guard against bigger security risks and to keep the United States, if Donald Trump is elected, tied into their respective regions. So I think I would say a weakened government in Japan is in a difficult position to capitalize on those very substantive agreements that we've seen. And that then raises the question, what can other countries like the UK do to help to keep those relationships close and mutually cooperative and beneficial? I think a lot more needs to be done at the level of convincing public opinion in both our country and in Japan about the importance of that type of cooperation. The Japanese electorate, if this election is a bellwether, is very concerned about its own domestic concerns. And that's maybe part of this broader trend that we see of electorates worried about their economic vulnerability at home and therefore less willing to pay what is often the very expensive price of maintaining security globally. And that then comes back to questions of leadership. Who sets the agenda, whether in Japan or in the UK, for saying why all these governments need to take the often expensive and challenging step of maintaining security globally, both regionally and internationally.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I think one interesting sort of global wave has been towards this very domestically oriented, for lack of a better term, kind of small bore economic policy. I mean, before I came into the center today, I was watching the Chancellor's speech on the budget in the UK, and I was struck by the fact that everything she emphasized was essentially small bore technical tweaks. There was no grand agenda to the budget. It was all about business rates and thresholds for capital gains and very very consequential things for people who are going to be affected by this, but very small sort of turns of the dial on almost exclusively domestically focused pieces of an economic agenda. There was no sort of grand picture of what this could mean for international affairs, at least that I saw in that speech. And I noticed the same thing in important policy speeches in the US, in country after country. So I think this is maybe a hill that we all have to climb in many countries about actually convincing people to buy into a larger security agenda in the face of real and sometimes perceived to be even bigger than the real economic difficulty and malaise at home. One more audience question did come in kind of at the last minute. Actually, two did, but I'll just ask you the one that I saw before just now, because this person hasn't asked a question before, and it's also very narrow and technical. So it give you a chance to answer quickly. Assuming that the LDP can form a government, but it isn't stable, would it then make sense for them to call a simultaneous election in July of 2025? In other words, that would mean elections held on the same day for both the House of Representatives and the House of Councillors. Doing this, according to the questioner, has worked well for the LDP in 1980 and 1986. Would they be inclined to do it now, and why or why not?
I think if the election timetable allows them to, if they lost a confidence vote, they might not have control over that timetable to be able to do just that. One would have to look at the rules of parliamentary procedure, and I'm not going to go out on a limb and say decisively that they would have that degree of flexibility. I think if they did, then yes. I mean, in the past, it has helped precisely because it generates higher turnout, and higher turnout has tended to work in favour of the LDP as it did in 1980. Although sometimes there are other factors that work in favor of that increased turnout. Sometimes it's kind of emotional attachments. In 1980, it was the death of a senior politician that bolstered support for the LDP. There isn't really anything quite comparable at the moment, looking ahead to the upper house election. And again, the danger for the LDP is that it looks opportunistic. It's really important for Ishiba to demonstrate that he can provide a credible response to this question of bad faith, as well as delivering economic, if not prosperity, at least the hope of an economic outcome that is going to address these very substantive domestic economic concerns of the electorate.
Excellent. Well, I think that about wraps it up, unless there was anything more that you wanted to add.
No, I think we covered the waterfront.
Great.
It's still a moving target, but it demonstrates, if anyone were minded to argue otherwise, that Japanese politics is very interesting and, like politics in so many other parts of the world, prone to instability and unexpected events.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone in the audience who stayed with us all of the time. And thanks very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.